Hi, students, how you doing? This is Coach Kelly, or as my soccer people call me, Coach Kelly, sir. But today I'm going to be Captain Kelly again. We're going to resume our classes. The first one, if you recall, we're on power boating and boating, sailboating. And we also covered kelp at that time. Now we're going to start, today's lesson is going to be on currents, tides, and water safety. So we're going to first start off with tides. And as you recall, we wound up talking about tide pools originally, and also the beach. And the best time to see those is on low tide. And we're going to be talking about what influences the tides, high tides, low tides, and currents. And generally, tides are something that goes up and rises in the ocean and goes down. And currents are what's called lateral movements. They move in and out. So one goes up and then goes down, goes up on high tide and down on low tide. And the other currents move in this direction and this direction. Okay, so first we're going to be taking a look at some tide pools and how they're influenced. Okay, so here's an example of a tide pool, and generally tide pools are available on low tides. The tide has to be all the way out. Otherwise, there can be many feet of water over the top of it. So, and there can be big waves breaking. Now, here's an example of some of the things that are collected in tide pools. And they're kind of fun to explore. We have a lot along the Monterey coast and along the Big Sur coast. And the best time to explore these is in the summer months. And you can be careful and make sure there's no big waves. And we're going to talk about that during our water safety. But you can see crabs like this and many other types of invertebrates that suck onto the rocks and embed themselves. So anyway, tide pools are something that you'd want to be able to see on low tide. And we're going to tell you how to determine that in the future. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be looking at is the changes in tides and why tides are important. Now, tides can be harnessed for energy purposes, and we're going to be talking about that in the future, a little while down the road. But right now, it's important to know that tides go up and tides go down. And there's a cycle involved in tides, and we're going to be talking about that. But basically, tides come in and rise, and that's called a flood tide, and that lasts about 6 hours total. And then the tide is still and doesn't move, and that's called slack tide. And then the tide turns around and starts to ebb or to go out, and it goes down. So it comes in during flood tide and then reaches a peak, and at that peak it's called a slack tide, and then it starts to fall. It goes all the way down, and it's called an ebbing tide, and when it stops, again, it's called a slack tide. And that's 6 hours that it goes up, and then 6 hours that it goes down. So we're going to be taking a look at that cycle. So if we had a 6 hour change, and it went up for 6 hours and down for 6 hours, how many times would the tide change during the day? So let's say 6 hours. And how long is the day? I think it's how many hours? I'm not going to tell you. You're going to need to figure this one out. But it changes how many times a day. Okay, well, you guys can figure that one out, I think. So anyway, let's take a look in a little faster action of the tide going up and the tide going down. Okay, now you can see on this location, the tide is going to start to come in. And this is sped up, but as we said, it'll take 6 hours for the tide to come up. But you can see how low the tide is now, and boats really couldn't even come in and dock at the dock. But as the tide comes in, and you can see it coming in, it's going to come up and up and up, which it's doing now. It's going to come all the way up to where we are here, taking the video from. And this is over a 6-hour period total. So it's going to fill all the way in, and it's going to come all the way up and reach its peak. And when it reaches its peak, it's called slack tide. And that's where we're at now. It's almost all the way up. And then it's slack tide, and then the tide starts to go out again. Okay. Okay, so we talked about tide pools, which is one of the cool things that happens on low tide. And the other thing that I like is this is a picture of me. On low tide, the beach is very hard, and you can take your bike on the beach. Sometimes you have to let a little bit of air out of the tires, but generally most bikes will ride on the beach at low tide, and you can sometimes go for miles on the beach at low tide. And again, it's important to know when low tides are going to be, and we're going to talk a little bit about how you determine that. But here's another picture of a boat on low tide. And as you can see, you wouldn't want to be able to drive in with a boat and try to dock here on low tide because there's no water. So it's important to know when the tides are low and when the tides are high. And again, a lot of times during tidal changes, there can be really, really fast moving, as you can see, currents that go in and out, and also can form whirlpools that can happen during tidal changes. So anyway, we're going to talk about how to determine tide changes.